West who had gone to war to aid the Poles in 1939 could aid them as little in 19 with the Wehrmacht. Quote, near a large inn, the Roter Krug, stood a barn, and to each of its two doors a naked woman was nailed through the hands in a crucified posture. In the dwellings we found a total of 72 women, including children and one man, 74, all dead, all murdered in a bestial fashion, except only for a few who had bullet holes in their heads. Some babies had had their heads bashed in. End quote. Soviet officer Leonid Rabachev wrote about what he witnessed in East Prussia. Quote, women, mothers and their children lie to the right and left along the route, and in front of them stands a raucous armada of men with their trousers down. The women who are bleeding or losing consciousness get shoved to one side, and our men shoot the ones who try to save their children. End quote. The German women were being gang raped in front of their husbands and in front of their children, and men who tried to intervene were often killed. Rape victims were often killed. The future author of the Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was serving as an artillery officer in the Red Army at this time, wrote, quote, all of us knew very well that if the girls were German, they could be raped and then shot. This was almost a combat distinction. Had they been Polish girls or our own displaced Russian girls, they could have been chased naked round the garden and slapped on the behind. End quote. And it should be noted, it's hard to figure out what percentage of the Red Army was behaving this way. It was such a diverse army made up of so many different ethnic groups and personality types. You had almost puritanical communist ideologues that not only frowned upon this stuff, but wrote horrible tales in shock about it. You had recently released POWs who were committing acts of revenge. You had people that were press-ganged from the occupied territories, handed a rifle and pushed forward to the lines. You had some of the worst of the Soviet prisoners let out of prison. By 1945, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel in the question of manpower, and the people that are in East Prussia committing these kinds of horrible acts are not necessarily the best representatives of Soviet society. In addition to this, many, many of them are drunk. Alcohol is playing a major role in all of this atrocious behavior. And the Germans know that alcohol is playing a major role. In fact, it is they who put it in front of the Soviet troops often, knowing that most soldiers will drink if alcohol is available. The Germans leave stores of alcohol for the Soviet troops to find, hoping that they'll get drunk and then they can be taken advantage of militarily. Instead, the alcohol and the inebriation helps the Red Army to take advantage of the civilians in that area in atrocious ways. It backfired on the Germans massively. But the Red Army troops didn't need alcohol to be angry at the Germans and to take revenge on them. The communist state had actively encouraged a feeling of revenge. They had built up this idea of the fascist beasts, which is what they called the Nazis. Stalin, for example, encouraged his troops to keep what were called ledgers of revenge, which recorded German atrocities that the troops had seen on the way to Germany, and then encouraged them to match the atrocities they saw with personal contributions of their own towards leveling those accounts and settling those scores. Political officers held revenge meetings to encourage this same spirit. They were also holding meetings with titles like, "How shall I avenge myself against the German occupiers?" They're trying to instill a feeling of hate. The signs on the German roadsides erected by the Soviet propaganda department said things like, "Tremble with fear, fascist Germany, the day of reckoning has come." A French informant said that Soviet authorities had actually exhumed the bodies of 65,000 Jews killed near Odessa and had them placed along the roadside that was used by most Red Army troops on the way to Germany, and every 200 yards a sign was erected declaring, "Look how the Germans treat Soviet civilians." A female Red Army nurse said, quote, "I had so much hatred stored up, I thought, what are we going to do to these people when we get to Germany? I wanted to see the mothers who had given birth to these monsters. I thought that they would never be able to look us in the eye." End quote. A Russian historian wrote that, quote, "Hatred for the enemy had become the most important motivation for our men." End quote. By the time the Soviet leadership realized that they needed to tone down the rhetoric because the behavior was so out of hand, it was irreversible. Of the terrible things done to the German civilians in the East, one surviving German woman said, quote, "It was our Holocaust, but nobody cares." End quote. And the reason no one cared is because so many others had already experienced their Holocaust, and most of them at the hands of the Germans. A British POW in German hands said, after seeing how the Soviet POWs were treated by the German prison guards, quote, "I'll forgive the Russians absolutely anything they do to this country when they arrive. Absolutely anything," end quote. The treatment meted out to German civilians in East Prussia caused a panic among the Germans. They began picking up their things and fleeing the area, heading to Germany proper. It became what Anthony Beaver called the largest panic retreat in human history. More than 8.5 million German civilians on the roads leading to Germany, clogging the roads with columns so thick and so long they were easily seen by high-altitude bombers flying overhead. These refugee columns were made up almost entirely of women and children, since the men were all fighting or conscripted. It was winter. It was cold. It was a tragedy in the making, and more than 1 million of these people will disappear and are presumed dead from this flight from East Prussia. There were many reports that the Soviets were attacking fleeing refugees, but the Germans had done the same thing earlier in the war. And the Germans were now getting to experience the same thing that the Poles had experienced in 1939, that the French had experienced in 1940, and that the Soviets had experienced since 1941. As the Germans fleeing from East Prussia arrive in the overloaded trains in Germany and in places like Pomerania, their condition fills the local people with horror. One woman said, quote, "Huddled shapes, rigid with cold, barely able to stand up anymore and climb out. Thin clothing, mostly in tatters. A few blankets over bowed shoulders. Gray, hollow faces." Anthony Beaver says the stiff little bundles were removed from the cars and laid on the platform. These were the children who had frozen to death. That same woman said, quote, "Out of the silence came the cries of a mother who did not want to surrender what she had lost. Horror and panic overcame me. Never had I seen such misery. And behind this sight, a terrifying and powerful vision loomed up. We were these people. This was what was in store for us." End quote. When the Soviets approached Breslau in Silesia, refugees were killed in a stampede to reach the evacuation trains. The wounded and the sick had no chance at all of escaping, so the local authorities gave them each a grenade to use on themselves and to take any Red Army troops they could with them. Berlin was receiving 50,000 refugees every day. Most gave the impression of exhausted aimlessness, said one observer. On the 14th of January, 1945, the Volkssturm is mobilized. These are the old men and the young kids who are going to be the last line of defense against the Red Army. The old men tended to run away unless they were World War I veterans, and even then they ran away sometimes. The kids, though, could be fanatical and could give the Soviets trouble. There was one 12-year-old boy who was decorated after he destroyed 12 Russian tanks with Panzerfausts, which are like bazookas. A Soviet officer said it was the young ones who went on and on, meaning on and on fighting. One of the nicknames that the regular Wehrmacht army troops had for the Volkssturm was they called them the casseroles, because they said they were made up of a mixture of old meat and green vegetables. Seeing children as young as 13 in military uniform called up to fight for the defense of Berlin was part of the mind-boggling story of what the Germans themselves refer to as the Götterdämmerung, which is the composer Wagner's, Twilight of the Gods. Said one German soldier talking about these young Volkssturm Hitler Youth troops, quote, "They had been hastily dressed in worn uniforms cut for men and were carrying guns which were as big as they were. They looked both comical and horrifying, and their eyes were filled with unease like the eyes of children at the reopening of school. Some of them were laughing and roughhousing, forgetting the military discipline which was inassimilable at their age. We noticed some heart-wringing details about these children, who were beginning the first act of their tragedy. Several of them were carrying school satchels their mothers had packed for them with extra food and clothing instead of school books. A few of the boys were trading the saccharine candies which the ration allotted to children under 13. What could be done with these troops? What were they expected to perform? Was Germany heroic or insane? Who would ever be able to judge this absolute sacrifice?" End quote. When General Wiedling, in command of the defense of Berlin, is told by the head of the Hitler Youth that boys were ready to fight and in fact were already deployed for action, He was enraged to the point where he almost couldn't speak. Finally, witnesses say, using very coarse language, he denounced the whole idea of using the Hitler Youth in combat. Quote, "You cannot sacrifice these children in a cause that is already lost. I will not use them, and I demand that the order sending these children into battle be rescinded." End quote. Berliners who are walking around the capital city seem to have an inability to comprehend that the familiar surroundings that they're looking at are about to be swept away forever. Max Hastings has an interesting line about this inability to look at your surroundings and see them as they're going to look in a week or two or in a month. He writes, quote, "It is in the nature of war that many people find it impossible to acknowledge that the horrors that they witness represent reality, or that the familiar environment is doomed. How can the heart accept the signals of the brain, however powerful or rational, that a known universe in which the blotter stands where it has always stood, on the office desk, the sofa in the lounge of the house, the shop on the corner of the street, is about to disappear forever? If this phenomenon is true for ordinary mortals, then it becomes unsurprising that the Nazi leadership, with the notable exception of Albert Speer, retreated into fantasy, even as the Allied armies closed in for the kill." End quote. Imagine yourself if you knew in your head that an invading army outside your city would soon destroy your house and your neighborhood, and your neighbors would be dead on the streets in a short period of time. Could your mind project that reality forward? It was almost impossible for the Berliners who knew what was coming to imagine how much their world was about to change. What they couldn't imagine was being experienced by the people on the Baltic coast. There are stories, horrific stories, about the people trying to flee the Baltic areas. Heroic stories of ships coming into the Baltic ports, taking out refugees and trying to get them away from the fighting zone. Events and tragedies and heroics that could make a whole show in and of itself. The fantasies, though, of the Third Reich continue. On the 30th of January, 1945, on the 12th anniversary of his coming to power, Hitler issues a call for fanatical resistance by the soldiers and civilians, and he predicts that, quote, "In this struggle for survival, it will not be inner Asia that will conquer, but the people that have defended Europe for centuries against the onslaught from the East, the German nation," end quote. But all the carnage, by this point, seemed pointless to many of those fighting the war. German soldier Guy Zeyer said, quote, "There was nothing we could do about it. The screams of fear, the groans of the dying, the torrents of blood soaking into the ground like a vile sacrilege. Nothing. Millions of men could suffer and weep and scream, and the war would go on, implacable and indifferent. We could only wait and hope. But hope for what? To escape dying face down in the mud? And the war? All it needed was an order from the authorities, and it would end. An order which the men would respect like a sacrament." End quote. Well, had the leadership running Nazi Germany been the same group of people that had run the First World War, the war would be over. All these atrocities, these rapes, the looting, the terrible treatment meted out to the German civilians would be postponed and prevented. But the Nazis were preparing themselves for Dämmerung, a twilight of the gods where they were going to go down in flames and bring the German nation down with them. As Hitler said way back in 1934, quote, "Even if we should not conquer, we should drag half the world into destruction with us and leave no one to triumph over Germany. We shall never capitulate, no, never. We may be destroyed, but if we are, we shall drag a world with us. A world with us." I should have said, a German with us, because those are the people he was going to drag down with him. By the 31st of January, the Russians are less than 40 miles. Just after the Red Army reaches the Oder River, outside of the Berlin area, Hitler copies Stalin's famous order, the not one step back order. Any troops who retreated were to be shot by their own people. He even included the communist idea of blockade detachments, where you put troops behind your troops with orders to shoot your own people if they moved in a reverse direction. On February 13th, Budapest is captured by the Russians. On April 13th, the Russians capture Vienna. In Berlin, the nervousness is affecting everyone and is palpable. Anthony Beaver relates a story of an incident on a train in Berlin right before the Soviet attack was due. He says, quote, A 16-year-old Berliner called Dieter Bokrowski described what he witnessed in a crowded S-Bahn train from the Anhalter Bahnhof. Quote, "There was terror in the faces of the people. They were full of anger and despair. I had never heard such cursing before. Suddenly someone shouted above the noise, 'Silence!' We saw a small, dirty soldier with 2 iron crosses and the German cross in gold. On his sleeve he had a badge with 4 metal tanks printed. He destroyed 4 tanks at close quarters. 'I've got something to tell you,' he shouted, and the carriage fell silent. 'Even if you don't want to listen to me, stop whining. We have to win this war. We must not lose our courage. If others win the war, and if they do to us only a fraction of what we've done in the occupied territories, there won't be a single German left in a few weeks.' It became so quiet in that carriage that one could have heard a pin drop. And the mood in Berlin in 1945 is almost like a Twilight Zone episode. It's almost a real-world experiment into the idea, what would you do if you knew the world was about to come to an end? Anthony Beaver says that people spent their money as if there were no tomorrow. There were stories of young girls coupling with strangers in the dark corners of bomb shelters. Beaver says this was part of a desire to, quote, dispense with innocence, end quote. What would you do if you knew that the apocalypse was upon you and you only had a month or so to go? Well, outside of Berlin, the Red Army was putting together and mobilizing 2.5 million men, 6,300 tanks, 42,000 guns and mortars, 7,500 combat aircraft, a force that Anthony Beaver calls the greatest concentration of firepower ever amassed. The Germans were trying to defend the area with approximately 1 million men, but a quarter of those are old men and kids. They have about 1,500 tanks. Pretty much no aircraft. The city of Berlin was 320 square miles in size. Had a pre-war population of 4 million civilians. 2 million were still there to face the offensive in 1945. The Soviet efforts to take Berlin are immensely complex. It's not just a brute force affair. The Soviet commanders and the planners, they show a high degree of sophistication in the way they want to go about this. The offensive that will eventually take place starts by attacking about 40 miles away from the city itself, and it begins in darkness early on April 16, 1945. Some 42,000 artillery pieces launch a massive bombardment that will go on for days. The Red Army has stockpiled more than 7 million shells for just this occasion. Aircraft launched more than 6,500 bombing and raiding sorties. The shelling of the 42,000 guns creates a weird effect in the outskirts of Berlin, some 35 miles from the actual battleground. Pictures begin falling off the walls in people's homes, and the books tumble off the shelves. Their telephones start ringing for no reason. There's a story of a cross hurtling to earth from a church steeple because of the vibrations. Windows and mirrors are shattering, lights are flickering, and everywhere, we're told, dogs are howling. There's a rumble like thunder in the distance. And this must have seemed, try to imagine yourself in this position. It's like a warning cry of the gods, isn't it? Imagine how ominous this must have seemed to the citizens in these areas. It all but screams, your doom approaches. It's like a telegram from hell. People could feel the very earth vibrating. Cornelius Ryan wrote about this moment right before the jumping off of the offensive into Soviet areas. He says, quote, "In the ranks were troops who had stood at Leningrad, Smolensk, Stalingrad, and before Moscow. Men who had fought their way across half a continent to reach the Oder River. There were soldiers who had seen their towns and villages obliterated by German guns, their crops burned, their families slain by German soldiers. For all these, the assault had special meaning. They had lived this moment of revenge. The Germans had left them nothing at home to return to, and they had nowhere to go but forward. Now they attacked savagely. Equally avid were the thousands of recently released prisoners of war, reinforcements that had been so urgently needed by the Red Army, that the newly freed prisoners, tattered, emaciated, many still showing the effects of brutal treatment, had been given arms. Now they too rushed forward, seeking a terrible death." End quote. So, very worried, the Germans might use chemical weapons to help this last attack. The Germans had nerve agents, which were much more effective than anything that was used in the First World War. And there was talk of miracle weapons all over Germany, and this had the Soviet high leadership worried about. chemical weapons might be used, and reports had reached Sweden that the chemical weapons had actually been distributed to the special troops in long boxes, with writing on the side saying, quote, "can only be used on the personal order of the Fuhrer," end quote. There were reports from some German generals that Hitler's close advisors were urging him to use what were called the weapons of despair. For one reason or another, they weren't used. Now, as the Gotterdammerung is beginning to come down on Nazi's head, the propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels has an interesting line that I've never heard before. He said on April 17th in a speech to his own party, "Everyone now has a chance to choose the part which he will play in the film 100 years hence. I can assure you that it will be a fine and elevating picture. Hold out now, so that 100 years hence the audience does not hoot and whistle on the screen." That's a really interesting way to view the end of your life as all hell's breaking out. Another Goebbels line, which had sort of a hint of a theatrical reference, before he took his own life and his wives. He said, quote, "The earth will shake as we leave the scene," end quote. The earth was definitely shaking. Now, if the Soviets were not showing a ton of humanitarian concern for their enemy, they weren't showing much for their own troops either. Marshal Zhukov later explained to American General Eisenhower how his military forces treated the impediments that the Germans were laying out in front of him, places like minefields. He said to Eisenhower, quote, "When we come to a minefield, our infantry attacks exactly as if it were not there. The losses we get from personnel mines we consider equal to those we would have gotten from machine guns or artillery if the Germans had chosen to defend that particular area with strong bodies of troops instead of with minefields," end quote. So human life, about zero at this point in the game. In early April, as Berlin drowns in the foreboding of the upcoming Soviet head of the SS issues an order all males 14 years or older are to be shot in any house where any sort of also, any penalties imposed on those males are to be imposed on the families of offenders too. So if someone in your family deserted, the whole family gets treated as if they deserted, and they'll all be shot. So, the worst atrocities against their own people. Now, as Hitler and his regime seem to become more and more inhuman, according to Richard Overy, Stalin actually shows a little degree of humanness at this point in the war. Looking somber and uncharacteristically thoughtful, he supposedly told Marshal Zhukov, quote, "What a terrible war. How many lives of our people it has carried away. There are probably few families of us left who haven't lost someone near to them," end quote. As a way of sort of explaining this uncharacteristic behavior, Zhukov says that at this time, Stalin seemed to him close to exhaustion, utterly overworked, of the dictator. On April 20th, 1945, it's Hitler's birthday. The Soviet offensive is expected at any time to reach Berlin. Extra rations are ordered for the city's population. Through nearly 5 hours of air raids that happened that day because Hitler's birthday prompted an extra big air attack from the Allies, Berlin's housewives braved the bombs to pick up the extra food. These rations were supposed to last for 8 days. Annalisa Bayer told her husband, quote, "With these rations we shall now ascend into heaven," end quote. And a lot of people in Berlin felt the same way. The extra rations started to be known as Ascension Day rations, and the mood in Berlin was a doomed one. A professor at a Berlin chemical plant remembers how when the plant was shut down before the arrival of the Soviets, quote, "We all bid farewell to one another until life after death," end quote. Field Marshal Paulus, he the commander of Stalingrad, serving his time in a Soviet prison cell in 1945, said, quote, "It is 2 years since the Stalingrad catastrophe, and now the whole of Germany is becoming a gigantic Stalingrad." Early in April, citizens in Berlin are referring to their city as the Reich's funeral pyre. First, the shells start landing on Berlin itself. Cornelius Ryan describes it, quote, "The sound was unlike anything Berliners had ever heard. Unlike the whistle of falling bombs or the crack and thud of anti-aircraft fire. Puzzled, the shoppers who queued up outside the Karstadt's department store on Hermannplatz listened. It was a low keening coming from somewhere off in the distance, but now it rose rapidly to a terrible piercing scream. For an instant, the shoppers seemed mesmerized. Then suddenly, the lines of people broke and scattered. Artillery shells, the first to reach the city, burst over the square. Bits of bodies splashed against the boarded-up storefront. Men and women lay in the streets screaming, writhing in agony. It was exactly Saturday. Berlin had been. Shells now began to strike everywhere. Tongues of flame leaped from rooftops all over the center of the city. Bomb-weakened buildings collapsed. Automobiles were upended and set afire. The Brandenburg Gate was hit, and one cornice crashed into the street. Shells plowed Unter der Linden from one end to the other. The royal palace, already wrecked, burst into flames again. So did the Reichstag. The girders that once supported the building's cupola collapsed, and hunks of metal showered down. People ran wildly, dropping briefcases and packages, bobbing frantically from doorway to doorway. At the Tiergarten end of the street, a stable of riding horses received a direct hit. The screams of the animals mingled with the cries and shouts of men and women, and an instant later, the horses stampeded out of the inferno and dashed down the road, their manes and tails blazing. The terrible reality of the total war that the Germans had introduced so much of the rest of the world to was now coming home to roost in their very capital. The hungry civilians in Berlin still had to line up at the shops to get their food, even as the fighting raged and the shells fell all around them. Civilian casualties were extremely heavy. Says, quote, like Napoleonic infantry, the women standing in line for food simply closed ranks after a shell burst decimated the queue. Nobody dared to use their guns. Some claimed that women just wiped the blood from their ration cards and stuck it out. There they stand like walls, those who not so long ago dashed into bunkers the moment 3 fighter planes were announced over central Germany. Women queued for a handout of dry sausage, while men emerged only to line up for a It seemed to be symbolic. Women were concerned with the immediacy of survival, while the men needed to escape the consequences of their war. On April 22nd, 1945, Hitler decides to stay in Berlin until the end. The end is not that far away. 3 days later, Russian and U.S. troops meet on the Elbe River and close ranks around the German capital. Now, the actual military battle for Berlin is a little bit anticlimactic in a military history sense. After all, on the Eastern Front, we've all become accustomed to these colossal battles involving tons of armor as these two major world powers go toe-to-toe. The problem is, by the time the Battle of Berlin happened, the German army simply doesn't have the ability to do that. They had taken a chance and used a ton of their army to keep the Soviets from getting to this point. Lots of very bloody encounters in 1944 in the Baltics and over in what's now Poland, and fighting to slow the Red Army down leaves the German army with little left to fight with by the time it comes to the capital's battle. And the reserve that actually had been there had been squandered rashly by Adolf Hitler in the West in a battle. I think the official name is the Second Battle of the Ardennes. But almost 1 million German soldiers were involved in that battle. Chewed up by Allied air power. Now Berlin is defended by some military units, which are shadows of real military units, and a lot of civilians. And no one, except in his less lucid moments, had any illusions about the idea of winning. There was no military outcome defined as winning. So what were these people fighting for? Well, the German generals, some of them, showed a real humanitarian and pro-Germany streak in them at the last minute. Hitler wanted the whole country to go down in flames. He wanted the fighting to occur in Berlin, even though all the civilians were trapped there. A lot of these generals risked being shot to disobey those orders. They concentrated what little military units Germany had left on the outskirts of Berlin, on these heights overlooking the River Oder, for example. They set up a defensive line that was able to hold back the Soviet colossus for a few days. Units like the 9th Army made it sound to Hitler in his bunker like he actually had real military units to work with. But what was constituting the 9th Army at this point in the war never would have been considered a viable a couple of years. These forces were swept aside. The Soviets were able to break into Berlin, and the streets were destroyed. Now, typical of the Eastern War fighting, you encounter in these small unit battles and these desperate encounters every bit of heroism and personal bravery and sacrifice and horrificness and atrocity that you encounter in the rest of the Eastern War, on both sides. There are stories of SS units fighting fanatically to the last man, and there are other stories of SS units running around the city shooting everybody that they think is shirking their duty. Stories of Soviets, dying for each other to push forward toward Berlin and get the fascist enemy finally defeated. I mean, there's tons of stories, but they're all almost individual encounters. Days of large-scale military warfare on the Eastern Front are over. What are they fighting for? Are simply fighting to keep corridors of escape open so that civilians can escape from the east to the west, to try to avoid the fate that now all the Germans are afraid of, the stuff that was going on in places like East Prussia. So all this, on the part of some of these generals, was an attempt to minimize civilian casualties. And a lot of the civilians did benefit from domestic heroics to keep the corridors to the west open. People got away. While this is all going on, German civilians are huddled in shelters in the capital city. Some of these shelters full to the brim with 10 to 12,000 people in them, too cramped to move at all, even to go to the bathroom. They go right where they stand. The wounded are in these shelters screaming. Children are dying. People are dazed and unsure of what time of day it is. Shells are hitting the buildings constantly. In one of the largest shelters, the anti-aircraft facility known as the Zoo Bunker, there are 30,000 civilians crammed into the space. Insane from the shelter. Others are committing suicide in the room, but they're packed so tightly in space that they stand upright for hours after dying, pressed into a standing position around people around them. On April 30th, 1945, with the Red Army only a few hundred yards away, Hitler commits suicide with his new wife, Eva Braun. Even after Hitler's suicide, the Germans in Berlin continue fighting. The Soviets are forced to clear more than 300 city blocks in the German capital, house by house by house. It's Stalingrad fighting all over again. While the Soviets capture more and more of the German capital, more and more of the residents of Berlin begin to pay the horrible price for what the German armies had done in the Soviet East. Said Danish journalist and fan of the Soviet Union, Paul von Stamen, quote, "It was bitter to learn that Goebbels' propaganda had been factual and accurate. It was not that a sex-starved Russian soldier forced himself upon a girl who took his fancy. It was a destructive, hateful, and wholesale act of vengeance. Age or looks were irrelevant. The grandmother was no safer than the granddaughter. The ugly and filthy no more than the fresh and attractive." End quote. And it wasn't just single rapes. It was often gang rapes. Many women and young girls died as a result. And many more were never able to have children again after this terrible ordeal. And there was often a difference between the frontline soldiers and those who were following behind them in the rear. There was an incident at an orphanage and maternity clinic called the Haus Dahlem. When Soviet troops first arrived, their officers were impeccably behaved. But they warned the Mother Superior, quote, "These are good, disciplined, and decent soldiers, but I must tell you, the men who are following us, the ones coming up behind, are puppets." The ones coming up behind repeatedly raped the pregnant, those who had recently been girls as young as 10 and 12 years old. They raped the nuns. The screams echoed. When Berlin resident Dora Jansen complained to a Russian officer about the women being raped, he looked at her coolly and said, quote, "The Germans were worse than this in Russia. This is simply revenge." End quote. He was right. Some in the former Soviet Union deny these stuff took place. There's a movement there that says that this is all exaggerated versions of German propaganda. Red Army officer and witness to all of this, Boris Gorbachevsky, wrote, quote, "The elements of hatred and revenge had, by the end of January 1945, become a raging, inundated river. If we are to be honest, all sorts of things took place. Brutality, sadism, cynical, crude acts, unbridled lust, and at times, even murders. In this raging storm of retribution, the primary instigators of the violence became the commanders and political workers, the commissary staff and the SMERSH agents, as well as the military commandants. An insignificant portion of the officers sought not to have anything to do with the general madness of violence against people. For example, in Poznan, Prylengaville, my comrades saved women from rapes. Individual commanders and political workers who openly protested against the outrages against the civilian population suffered for it. Among those who did was the later well-known dissident Lev Kopelev. Unfortunately, the Russian press," he writes, "has been concealing the truth about the Red Army's conduct in Germany now for more than 60 years. Here's what the 12-volume official history has to say on the subject. Quote, not all Soviet soldiers correctly understood how they should behave in Germany. In the first days of combat in East Prussia, there were a few incidents of improper conduct. End quote. He continues. Here is another striking example. In his memoirs, K.K. Rokossovsky wrote, "It must be said that our people demonstrated real humanity and nobility on German soil." Gorbachev says, other former Soviet military commanders have written similar things in the same spirit in their memoirs. In a 2005 video conference of Russian and German historians on topical questions of the Second World War, a Russian historian from the State Humanitarian University, Elena Sinievskaya, who participated in this video conference, declared that the Red Army had never made a formal study of the outrages inflicted on the civilian population of Germany. She acknowledged only isolated cases of inhumane treatment on the part of Soviet servicemen towards the local population, and maintained that they had been fully prosecuted all the way up the military tribunals. I won't argue with Elena Sinievskaya or make accusations against her. It's a pointless venture, he says. I'll assume she doesn't know the real facts. In fact, the Lev Kopolev that Gorbachev mentions was actually arrested by Soviet authorities on charges of what was called bourgeois humanitarianism for protesting the rapes and similar acts. This is one reason so many Russians today don't know about these events. Discussing or publicizing these occurrences were not just discouraged, they were punishable offenses. Now, it should be noted that the official Soviet military penalty for both raping and looting was death, but it wasn't often carried out in 1945. However, there are some stories where it was. There's one story where an officer shot a lieutenant right on the spot for reportedly lining his troops up to gang rape a woman. But the officers had a very hard time controlling troops who had often been drinking and who were armed with heavy weapons and submachine guns. Stalin himself showed little concern over the raping and looting, even when it happened to his allies. When a Yugoslavian partisan leader complained to him personally that Soviet soldiers were raping Yugoslavian women, Stalin said to him, quote, "You have, of course, read Dostoevsky. Do you see what a complicated thing is a man's soul, man's psyche? Well then, imagine a man who's fought from Stalingrad to Belgrade, over thousands of kilometers of his own devastated land, across the dead bodies of his comrades and dearest ones. How can such a man react normally? And what is so awful of his having fun with a woman after such horrors? You've imagined the Red Army to be ideal, and it is not ideal, nor can it be. The important thing is that it fights Germans. The rest doesn't matter." There was a famous boast by a Soviet veteran that 2 million of our children were born in Germany. Not like the number of abortions after the war skyrocketed. Now, it may seem that I'm lingering salaciously on these rapes, but I want to point out that if you talk to Germans, and they will speak to you because they won't know what it's about, the most dramatic, lingering effect of the whole war are the rapes in Germany that were part of what the Red Army did to the German civilians. This traumatized the German population. To them, you can't spend enough time speaking about this aspect of the Red Army's conquest of the eastern part of the country. It's a trauma that still haunts Germany today. Suicides became very common after these rapes. Rape victims took their own lives, often took their loved ones, such as their husbands or children, with them. The leading Nazis were also killing themselves at a furious pace. One example is the head of the German Red Cross, Ernst Grauer. He was suspected of ordering heinous crimes to be committed, so he and his family sat down to dinner, and with everyone seated, he reached down and pulled the pins on 2 hand grenades and blew the whole family up. Welcome to the reality of the Götterdämmerung. One of the things that I often think about is post-war Germany, and the people that were walking around in that society. Isn't that a whole society of people who are post-traumatic stress disorder victims? I mean, we'll talk about someone, for example, here in the United States, who comes home from a war in Vietnam, and who needs to have years of counseling, has perhaps substance abuse problems with their marriage, or God forbid, some of them even can't get the experiences or what that war did to them out of their psyche. Now imagine a whole society of those people. I mean, just think of the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of rape victims, or children of the rape victims who watch their mothers be raped, or the brothers who watch their sisters be raped, or the parents who watch their daughters be raped. Don't you think that that leaves a psychic scar? combine that with the returning soldiers who lived through a Stalin or a Kursk, or those desperate, terrible battles on the Baltic coast in 1944 and 1945. All these people walking around in a post-war society together, under occupation. It's amazing that the society didn't just go insane, that generation could push forward and continue and build a post-war society into something admirable. Because I can't think of a more traumatized group of people than that. Unless, of course, it's the people on the other side that they traumatized. Maybe it's fair to say that the nations who fought this war in the East in the Second World War were all traumatized. Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, a continent of traumatized people. And Churchill's comments that he made at Yalta seem particularly apropos. He said, quote, "I do not suppose that any moment of history has the agony of the world been so great or widespread. Tonight, the sun goes down on more suffering than ever before." End quote. I also want to point out that these atrocities that the Red Army was committing on the German population are human things. There were people that tended to make them Russian things or Soviet things. These are part of age-old human practices. Look at the Romans, who were excited about the prospects, for example, of sacking the city of Cremona so that they could rape the inhabitants. The inhabitants of the city of Cremona were Roman, too. It was part of a Roman civil war. These Romans were excited about the prospect of raping their own country. The recent situation in Bosnia in the early 1990s was just a recent example of rape being used as a weapon, something that's gone on throughout human history. Even the American conduct in Vietnam is something we can look at, pointing out the humanness of rape in combat. U.S. General Eugene Lynch, who served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, spoke of atrocities that American soldiers were involved in the Vietnam War. He said, quote, "In any war, when you lose so much, soldiers will want revenge. Anytime you have a losing situation, you've got a potential My Lai. This is why it is up to the commander to set the tone and to halt it." But what happens if the officers don't do that? This is who we are when the thin veneer of civilization is stripped by the violence of the all-out killing of us. You take away that thin veneer, and we revert to something of another age. We turn into those many of the other situations throughout history where people have acted in a bestial manner, where we can look in our living rooms today as we read the stories and say, how can people act that way? And the answer is, under the right conditions, we can act just like those people. We live this over and over again. We are not as civilized as we care to be. And something tells me that some Russian soldier in Berlin, some Roman soldier in Cremona, some Bosnian soldier in were they here right now, would point this fact out. And if you find yourself feeling a little strange over this whole thing, feeling bad for the bad guys, in a way, in truth, the people on all sides of this war were the victims of terrible governments. The war itself, launched by the Nazi regime, opened up the Pandora's box, unleashing a violence that corrupted everyone. As Boris Gorbachev wrote, war is first and foremost a tragedy. War is not only heroic feats and battles, as I had previously imagined. War is also the daily grind of a man trapped in unbearable conditions. It is blood, filth, and sweat. It is life in extreme circumstances. War erases the boundaries between good and evil. It makes the unique, sacred gift, human life. And it should also be pointed out, for the sake of it, that there are quite a few stories of Soviet troops acting surprisingly benevolent to the Germans they found, providing them with bread, doting on the German kids having a weakness for German children, patting them on the head and giving them food. Often the frontline soldiers behaved impeccably. When the fighting ended, the Soviets solved one of the most pressing problems the German civilians faced. They began feeding them. And this contrasted sharply with Goebbels' propaganda said the Soviets would do to the Germans once they had them in their power. When the fighting stops on the 2nd of May, 1945, the Soviet General Chuikov walks around and he's stunned by the silence following the unbelievable noise that had been there the whole time. And he says that a thought struck him at that moment, quote, "The flame of the war quenched here once in a walls. We have no clear understanding of how many Germans were killed in the fighting. There was no one on the German side counting bodies. They didn't expect to keep such statistics with themselves, dodging shells and the numbers have always been all over the map. As bad as those numbers are, though, they're a drop in the bucket when you throw them into the overall casualty figures for this war in the East. Without the war in the East, the Second World War loses a ton of its bite. With the war in the East, it becomes easily the worst war ever fought on this planet. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, researchers and historians have had to increase their estimate of the losses in the Soviet Union. Losses that were already unbelievably high. The current estimates, and that's what they are, estimates because no one knows for sure, are that 10 million Red Army soldiers died in the fighting between 1941 and 1945. Add to that a further 18 million people on the Soviet side wounded, people who lost arms and legs or who were paralyzed for life. That's 28 million military casualties. Historian Richard Overy put that into perspective when he said that of the 34.5 million men and women mobilized by the Red Army, an astounding 84% of those people were killed, wounded, or captured. I'm not sure there's a percentage like that anywhere in military history in the modern world. Now, the civilian casualties dwarf even that. The estimates, and that's all they are estimates because no one will ever know, is that between 17 million and 25 million Soviet civilians died as a result of the fighting and the occupation. That means that the Soviet Union is darn near 40 million estimated casualties dead from the fighting. Than the population of many modern middle-sized countries. You cannot get your mind around a number that large. Sometimes it helps to look at the destruction instead. The Soviet Union had 70,000 villages due to the war, literally steamrolled or destroyed. 70,000 villages. More than 1,700 middle-sized towns were wiped off the map. More than 32,000 families destroyed. More than 25 million civilians made homeless. Now, the Germans suffered quite a few less casualties than the Soviets, but their numbers are still staggering considering Western allies. They suffered 5.5 million military deaths in the war, more than 4 million of those coming in the East, and about 2.5 million civilians dead. That's an estimate that no one's quite sure. And of course, the Germans suffered occupation for decades afterwards. Some historians say that the Second World War's actual last act was when the Berlin Wall came down. And there's a tendency to think that once the war was over, the war was over. The people in the United States went home and celebrated. The people in Great Britain went home and celebrated. The people in the Soviet Union had to live with the war around them for decades. There are stories about those 25 million homeless Soviet civilians having to go out in the middle of winter and strip the German corpses that lay all around the villages of the uniforms to try to put them on so that they would live through the winter without freezing. There are stories of the cleanup that had to be handled by the local authorities, where they would take all these German corpses frozen in the middle of winter, put them in shallow graves, only to find that when the spring thaws came, the ravines and ditches and streams ran red as the blood. There are a few surviving photographs of what some of these figures did before the Germans were buried, and you see stretching from the feet of the cameraman all the way to the horizon, frozen German corpses. The cleanup would take forever. descendants will be fighting for centuries the mass graves on the battlefield sites.
Für den ist der Krieg gelaufen!
There's an old historical line, and it's certainly a cliche. Santa Anna is reported to have said it. Those who do not remember the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. I've always wondered if those bones as a stark reminder of the lessons of history, especially when you realize that with today's modern weaponry, ever two major world powers like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union faced off again, they would do so with weapons that could deliver what it took 4.5 years for those two powers to deliver in about 4.5 minutes. Any luck from the East in the Second World War, just war human beings ever fight.
Feindliches Geschütz! Achtung, feindliches Geschütz! In Deckung, schnell jetzt!